First story, The Hollow Man. I never believed in ghosts, or monsters, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. That was before I moved to Washington. It started when I rented a small house in a quiet neighborhood just outside Olympia. The place was old but cheap. The landlord, a wiry man named Mr. Holloway, barely spoke, just handed me the keys and left. I should have known something was off. The air inside was thick, like dust and mildew had settled into the bones of the place. But I was broke, desperate, and had nowhere else to go. The first night, I heard scratching in the walls. Rats, I figured. The second night, I heard whispering. Not from the walls. From inside my room. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. The third night, I saw him. It was past midnight. The house was silent, but the air felt heavier than before. I rolled over in bed, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Tall, thin, with hollow eyes like deep black wells. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just watched. My body locked up. My throat clenched, but I forced out a whisper. Who are you? Nothing. He stood there, head tilting slightly, as if studying me. I scrambled for my phone, but the second I turned back, he was gone. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked every corner of the house. Windows locked, doors bolted, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Then the notes started appearing. The first one was tucked under my coffee mug. A small, crumpled scrap of yellowed paper, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Get out. I laughed. A nervous, hollow laugh. Someone was messing with me. But who? I didn't know anyone in this town. The second note was worse. It was waiting for me on the bathroom mirror, stuck with something dark and sticky. He sees you. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to stay, but I had nowhere else to go. I did the only thing that made sense. I set up cameras. That night, I sat in my car watching the live feed on my phone. At first, nothing happened. Just an empty house, dimly lit by the streetlights outside. Then, at 2:14 a.m., movement. The bedroom door creaked open. Slowly, carefully. Like something was being careful not to wake me. And then, he stepped into the frame. The same figure. Tall, gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones. But this time I saw his face clearly, and I wished I hadn't. His eyes weren't just hollow. They were missing. Just empty, gaping sockets. His mouth stretched too wide, his jaw unhinged like a snake's. He turned as if looking at the camera, though he had no eyes. And then the worst part, he smiled. I shut off the feed. My hands trembled so hard I dropped my phone. I was done. I had to leave. But when I turned the ignition, the car wouldn't start. I fumbled for my phone, fingers slipping over the screen as I tried to call 911. No service. I looked back up at the house. The front door was open, and he was standing on the porch. I locked the doors, heart slamming against my ribs. My breath fogged the windshield. He took a slow step forward, then another. I reached for the glove compartment, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Then my phone vibrated. A message. Look behind you. Cold terror shot through me. I didn't want to turn, but I had to. In the rearview mirror, I saw him, sitting in the back seat. His face was inches from mine, that same impossibly wide smile splitting his face. I opened my mouth to scream, but before a sound escaped, everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed. The nurses told me I was found unconscious on the side of the road, my car wrapped around a tree. No sign of anyone else. I moved out of Washington the next week. Left everything behind. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel him watching. And at night when I close my eyes, I see that empty smile. And I know he's still there. Waiting. Because the last note I found, tucked under my hospital pillow, said one final thing. You can never leave. Second story, The Shadows of Raven Hill. I didn't want to go back. Raven Hill was never a place I felt comfortable in. The town itself was small, tucked away in the deep woods of Washington State. Most people didn't even know it existed unless they were born there or had some old, forgotten family ties to the place. I didn't have family there. At least, I thought I didn't. But when I received the letter, I had no choice but to return. The letter was simple enough. Come home. There are things you need to know, Mother. It had been 10 years since I'd left. 10 years since I'd seen my mother's face, heard her voice, or even thought about Raven Hill. I had moved on, built a life in Seattle, and erased all memories of my past. But that letter stirred something inside me. A connection, a pull I couldn't ignore. So I packed my bags and drove out of the city, down winding roads that led me through dense forests, past dilapidated barns, and abandoned farmhouses, until I reached the place that had haunted my dreams, Raven Hill. I stood at the edge of town, the weight of nostalgia pressing down on my chest. The houses were small and old, their windows cracked and dirty. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted streets. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like the town had been forgotten by time. I walked to the house that once belonged to my family. It was just as I remembered, only now it looked even more decayed, the paint peeling, the door hanging off its hinges. The yard, once full of flowers and laughter, was overgrown with weeds, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the land. The door creaked open as I pushed it, the hinges protesting in a way that made my skin crawl. Inside, the house was colder than I expected. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and everything was covered in a thick layer of grime. It looked like no one had been here in years. I called out for my mother, but there was no answer. The silence in the house was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it. A low whisper, almost like a sigh, coming from the stairs. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. I slowly made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway at the top was dark, the walls covered in strange symbols, old and worn, almost like they had been carved into the wood. I reached my mother's room, but when I opened the door it was empty. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled in a heap, a cold, damp feeling filled the room, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. And then I saw it. On the far wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "They are waiting." I turned to leave, but before I could, the door slammed shut behind me. The room went dark, and the temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath in front of me. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on it, shouting for help. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming closer. The shadows in the room began to move, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. I backed into the corner, my heart racing. I could feel something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then I saw her. My mother. But it wasn't really her. Her face was pale and twisted, her eyes wide and empty, as if all life had been drained from her. She reached out toward me, her hand cold and clammy, her fingers stretching unnaturally long. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the air itself had turned to stone. I turned to run, but the shadows closed in on me, pulling me back toward the figure of my mother. "You should have never come back," she whispered in a voice that wasn't hers. The darkness overwhelmed me, and everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying in the middle of the road just outside Raven Hill. My head throbbed, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. I had no memory of how I had gotten there or what had happened in the house. The town was gone, as if it had never existed. There were no houses, no streets, just endless trees and fog. And then I heard it. A voice in the wind. "You're still here." I turned around, but no one was there. That's when I realized. Raven Hill was never a place that could be escaped. Once you entered, you were bound to it, trapped in the shadows of a past that would never let go. I didn't belong in the world anymore. Neither did the town. Third story. The Whispering Shadows of Washington. I had always heard about the strange things that happened in Washington, but I never thought much of it. A quiet city, full of people with their own lives, nothing to really be scared of. That was until I moved into an old house just outside of Olympia. It wasn't a mansion or anything grand, just a worn-down house with creaky floors and the smell of wood that hadn't been properly aired out in years. The house was cheap, too cheap. I figured I could fix it up, make it livable, and save a few bucks. But from the very first night, I felt something was off. It wasn't the house itself. It was the air, thick and heavy, like something was waiting for me to settle in. The first night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, but there was something else. Something almost like whispers, faint and unintelligible. I brushed it off as the house settling, maybe the trees scratching the windows, but it felt wrong. Too wrong. By the second week, the whispers got louder. I'd be sitting at my desk in the small office when I'd hear them, coming from the hallway. Soft, hushed voices calling my name. At first, I thought it was the neighbors, but there was something too personal about it. I remember getting up one evening to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked the entire house. Nothing. It was then I noticed the shadows. They were not just cast by the furniture or the moonlight. These shadows moved. I'd see them out of the corner of my eye, slipping across the walls, stretching, curling like they were alive. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. Every night, I'd hear more whispers, more voices, and sometimes footsteps. Sometimes they would sound like someone was walking down the hall toward my room, slow and deliberate. But when I would check, there'd be no one there. It wasn't until the third week that things escalated. One night, the whispering voices turned to screams. Blood-curdling, desperate screams that echoed throughout the house. I ran through the halls, trying to find the source, but the house seemed endless. The walls were closing in, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet like they were alive, groaning under the weight of something unseen. I finally made my way to the basement, convinced something was hiding down there. When I opened the door, the air was suffocating, thick with a damp, musty smell that made my stomach churn. The light bulb above flickered before completely burning out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the switch, heart racing, and when I turned it on, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. There were symbols painted all over the walls in what looked like dried blood. Ancient, twisted symbols that made no sense, as if they were written by something that didn't belong in this world. And in the center of the room there was a mirror. It wasn't just any mirror. It was old, covered in dust, with a deep crack running down the center. But what made it horrifying were the figures in it. At first, I thought they were just reflections, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were moving. Their eyes followed me, their mouths whispered my name, their hands pressed against the glass. The room seemed to get colder, and my breath turned to mist. The figures began to move faster, their faces contorting into something monstrous, their eyes hollow, black pits. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, and the shadows, those damn shadows, rushed toward me, engulfing the room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs gave way, and I collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, my mind spiraling into panic. That's when I saw it. The reflection in the cracked mirror wasn't mine anymore. The thing in the mirror was smiling, a grotesque grin stretching across its face as it reached its hand out from the glass. I backed away, my body shaking uncontrollably, but it wasn't fast enough. The thing grabbed me, its cold fingers digging into my skin, pulling me toward the mirror. I screamed, but it was too late. It was like I was sinking into the mirror, the glass breaking apart around me, and before I knew it, I was trapped in another world where shadows whispered and figures watched, waiting. And now I'm the one in the mirror. I can see everything, feel everything, but I can't move. I'm just another reflection, waiting for someone else to come along and make the mistake I did. And when they do, they'll join me. Fourth story, The Shadows Beneath Liberty Hill. It was an ordinary Saturday evening in Washington. The air was thick with the kind of humidity only the Pacific Northwest knows how to produce. I had just finished a long day at the small law firm I worked at downtown, the kind of day that left you drained, but with just enough energy to make it home. As I sat in my car, staring at the red traffic light, I found my mind drifting to the strange phone call I had received earlier that day. "Don't go to Liberty Hill tonight," the voice had said. No name, no explanation, just that eerie warning. It had come from a number I didn't recognize. I almost dismissed it as a prank, but the deep, hushed tone of the voice made me uneasy. I pushed the thought away, convinced it was nothing. I turned on the radio and tried to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. The city lights of Washington flickered in the distance, and the road was as familiar to me as my own skin. But something felt off tonight, like the air itself was holding its breath. As I drove towards Liberty Hill, an area known for its older colonial-style homes, I couldn't help but think about the strange warning. Liberty Hill was far from a ghost town, but it had its secrets. Old rumors about disappearances, the kind people whisper about after a couple of drinks. But none of that had ever seemed to bother me until now. I parked my car at the foot of the hill, the cobblestone streets glistening under the dim streetlights. The hill itself was quiet, almost too quiet. There was a strange heaviness in the air, like something was watching me from the shadows. I started walking up the hill, the eerie silence pressing in on me from every side. As I made my way to the old house at the top of the hill, I could hear the rustling of the trees, the wind whispering through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the feeling of eyes on me. I quickened my pace. The house at the top was just as I remembered it from childhood visits, old, Victorian, with ivy creeping up the walls like an infection. But tonight, it felt different. The windows were dark, the front door ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. There was no answer. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and the smell of dust and decay filled my nostrils. I wandered through the dimly lit rooms, the silence growing oppressive. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off the walls like some forgotten memory. As I reached the back of the house, I noticed a staircase leading down to a basement door, slightly cracked open. Without thinking, I descended the stairs. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The basement was pitch black, and I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding in my chest. When the light flickered on, I nearly dropped to the floor in shock. There, in the center of the basement, was a circle drawn in chalk. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the circle, something was moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. A figure, hunched and twisted, with pale skin and long black hair that clung to its face. It was breathing heavily, like it was in pain. I froze, my body refusing to move, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sick joke. But then it looked at me. Its eyes were black as coal, empty pits that seemed to swallow all the light around them. It opened its mouth, and a voice that wasn't its own whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the air grew thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The temperature dropped, my breath coming out in visible puffs. My heart was beating in my throat as I stumbled backward, my eyes never leaving the figure. It began to rise slowly, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching, snapping as it stood. I turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I could hear the figure dragging itself toward me, its steps slow and deliberate. I could hear its breath, hot and ragged. Then a sound, a low, guttural growl, came from behind me. I spun around, but the figure wasn't there anymore. Instead, the walls of the basement were moving, the symbols twisting and contorting like they were alive. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and I felt a presence closing in, surrounding me. The last thing I remember is a feeling of being pulled downward, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole. I woke up in my car, parked at the foot of Liberty Hill. My heart was racing, and I was drenched in sweat. The city lights of Washington glimmered in the distance, and everything seemed normal. Too normal. But as I looked down at my hands, I noticed something strange. My palms were covered in dirt, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. My eyes were black as coal. And that's when I knew. The figure hadn't just been a nightmare. It had followed me, and it wasn't finished with me yet. It was still waiting, just beneath the surface. Fifth story. The Shadows of Maple Street. It was a rainy night in Washington when I first noticed something was wrong. I had just moved into a small, two-story house on Maple Street, a quiet neighborhood that seemed to stretch for miles. The houses were old but well kept, and everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. The rain beat down in steady sheets, and the wind howled through the trees as if trying to tell me something. It was the kind of night where you could feel the air growing thicker, like it was holding a secret. I remember stepping into the house for the first time, the musty smell of old wood greeting me. There were cobwebs in the corners and a layer of dust on the floor, but I didn't mind. I was alone, and this place was mine now. The realtor had been in a hurry to leave, almost too eager to get out of the door when I signed the papers. It didn't seem right, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was just a house. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, rearranged furniture, and got used to the quiet. The neighbors were friendly, always waving as I drove by, but there was a strange distance between us. It was as if they were all hiding something they didn't want to share. It wasn't until the fifth night that I started noticing the oddities. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, the soft creak of floorboards above me. I had been sitting in my living room, reading a book when it happened. I froze, thinking it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, and then again. A slow, deliberate pacing above my head, like someone walking in heavy boots. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sounds continued for a few minutes, then abruptly stopped. I waited, but nothing came. I didn't know what to think. There was no one up there. The upstairs was just a couple of empty bedrooms. I'd made sure of that. Still, the feeling of unease crept over me. I wasn't alone. The next night, the same thing happened. The creaking, the footsteps. But this time, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the dark. The hallway at the top was cold, colder than usual, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I shined the flashlight into each of the rooms, but they were empty. There was no one here, just the silence and the dust. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The mirror in the hallway. It was old, antique even, and I could see my reflection staring back at me, but there was something else. In the corner of the glass, barely visible, was a shadow. It was faint, as if it didn't belong to me. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The shadow was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. I had a feeling that whatever was in this house was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I didn't want to. I wanted to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there. But it wouldn't let me. The next day, I visited the local library to learn more about the house. The librarian, an older woman with thick glasses, gave me a strange look when I asked about Maple Street. "You've moved into the old Greenway house, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, wondering what she knew. She leaned in closer. "That house has a history, you know. People who lived there before didn't stay long. Strange things happen there. Disappearances, unexplained deaths. You should leave before it gets worse." I felt a chill run down my spine. She didn't say anything more after that. Just returned to her books, her eyes watching me carefully. I left, my mind racing. I had to know more. That night, I did some research online and found old newspaper articles about the house. A family had lived there years ago, the Greenways, but they had disappeared without a trace. There was talk of strange noises, of whispers in the night, of people being driven mad by something unseen. I couldn't believe it, but the more I read, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. I wasn't the first person to feel it, and I wouldn't be the last. The following evening, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I waited until midnight, when the air was thick with anticipation. The wind howled outside, and the trees shook as if in warning. I stood in the center of the living room, holding a candle. The footsteps above me started again, slower this time, deliberate, like a slow march toward me. The house groaned under the pressure of whatever was walking above. My heart raced as the sound grew louder, closer. I could feel it. It was coming for me. Suddenly, the door to the basement creaked open, and I froze. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me. But something in my gut told me I had no choice. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand trembling. The stairs leading down to the basement were dark, the air thick with an overwhelming stench of decay. As I descended, the temperature dropped, and I could hear the distant sound of something scraping against the walls. At the bottom, I shined the light around, revealing nothing but old furniture and boxes. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. A door I hadn't seen before, hidden behind a pile of old furniture. I walked toward it, my breath shallow, and pushed it open. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. There, in the center of the room, was a mirror. The same one I had seen upstairs. But this one was different. It was cracked, jagged lines running across the glass, and the shadow I had seen before was now clearer, more defined. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a figure, tall, with hollow eyes, staring at me from within the reflection. I could feel it, watching me, its cold gaze seeping into my very soul. And then it smiled. I screamed, stumbling backward, but it didn't matter. The door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The last thing I remember was the cold hands wrapping around my throat, pulling me into the mirror, pulling me into the darkness where I'd been waiting for so long. And then, nothing. The house is still there on Maple Street. Empty. Waiting. And every now and then a passerby might hear footsteps in the distance, or see a shadow in the window, but no one stays long enough to find out what's truly inside. I know. Because I never made it out. Sixth story. The Whispering Woods of Washington. It all started when I moved to Washington. The city had its charm, with its tall trees and fog that hung over the streets like a thick, mysterious blanket. But something about it felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was. I had just bought a small, quaint house on the edge of town, near the woods. The locals didn't say much about the forest, other than it being a place people avoided after dark. Of course, curiosity got the better of me. One evening, just before the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to take a walk through the trees. I had heard stories about the forest, how it was haunted, how people heard whispers at night, but I dismissed them as old town legends. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches swaying like they were reaching for me. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it. At first, it was faint. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone was calling my name from deep within the forest. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, listening. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was nothing else. I shrugged it off as my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. Come closer. My blood ran cold. The voice was malevolent, echoing around me, like it was coming from every direction at once. I spun around, but there was no one. The trees stood still, their shadows long and menacing in the fading light. I was about to turn and leave when I saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement, something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. I hesitated, my body frozen in place, but my feet carried me forward, against my better judgment. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me on. Come, find us, they beckoned. It felt like hours before I stumbled upon a small clearing in the forest. In the center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisted into the earth like fingers clutching at the ground. Beneath it, something caught my eye. A faint, glowing mark carved into the bark. I stepped closer, my curiosity overpowering my fear. As soon as my hand touched the tree, the whisper stopped. A silence so heavy it felt like the air had thickened around me. Then I heard it, louder this time, a voice, not from the trees, but from behind me. Why did you touch it? I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. I was alone, or so I thought. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, tall and thin, with long, tangled hair that seemed to blend with the shadows. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, dark, hollow pits, stared into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She was wearing an old tattered dress as if it had been torn straight out of some forgotten era. Who are you? I managed to choke out, but she didn't answer. Instead, she raised a long, bony finger to her lips, as if to silence me. And then she spoke. We've been waiting for someone like you. Her words were not in a voice that could belong to any living being. It was cold, ancient, and chilling to the core. A voice from beyond. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into a dark hole, my hands clawing at the dirt, but there was nothing to hold on to. The world spun around me, and before I knew it, I hit the bottom. I lay there for a moment, dazed, when I realized I wasn't alone. Around me, pale figures, human-shaped but not quite human, emerged from the darkness. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies skeletal, wrapped in torn clothes. I could hear their whispers now, clearer than ever. Come, join us. Panic surged through me, but my body refused to move. The figures reached out, their cold, dead hands brushing against my skin, sending jolts of terror through my veins. My heart raced, but it was too late. I was trapped. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the woman's face looming over me, her hollow eyes staring down at me as she whispered one final phrase. You're one of us now. I woke up in my own bed the next morning, drenched in sweat, heart still racing. It felt like a nightmare, a terrible dream, but something was different. I walked to the window and looked out toward the woods. The trees seemed to sway, almost as if they were beckoning me back. And then I heard it again, the whispers. Come back. I couldn't resist anymore. Something inside me snapped. I stepped out the door, heading straight for the woods, drawn by an invisible force. And that was the last time anyone saw me. Seventh story. Whispers of the dark pines. I had always been fascinated by Washington's deep woods. The towering pines, their dark silhouettes against the moonlit sky, always seemed to whisper secrets to those brave enough to wander through them. I never considered myself a superstitious person, but that night was different. It was a cold November evening when I decided to take a solitary hike through the Cascade Mountains. My name is Ethan, and I've always preferred the peace of nature to the chaos of city life. The small town of Bellingham, where I grew up, was just a few hours away. But this time, I had wandered farther, deep into the forest, far from civilization. I had been walking for hours, following an old trail known to few. There were no signs, no markers, just the rustle of dead leaves beneath my boots and the eerie silence that seemed to swallow all sound. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin that I began to feel uneasy. The cabin was hidden from the main trail, covered by overgrown vines and surrounded by trees so thick they seemed to close in on it. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There were no animals, no chirping birds, no rustling squirrels, nothing. Only the wind whispering through the branches. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by a musty scent that seemed to choke the air. Inside, the space was filled with dust, cobwebs, and old furniture covered in a thick layer of grime. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. A feeling of being watched, as if the walls themselves were alive. I explored the cabin slowly, drawn toward a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The darkness below seemed to beckon, and for reasons I still can't understand, I descended. As soon as my foot touched the bottom, the air turned colder, much colder than it should have been. The basement was small, its only light coming from a single dim bulb hanging overhead. It flickered faintly, casting strange shadows on the stone walls. Then I saw it. At the far corner of the room, there was a wooden chest. It wasn't big, but it stood out in the otherwise empty basement. Something about it felt wrong, though, like it didn't belong there. My heart raced, but I approached it anyway. When I touched the lid, a chill ran down my spine and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside was an assortment of old objects, papers, trinkets, and a small wooden carving of a human figure. But something else caught my eye. Beneath the carving, a dark stain had soaked into the wood. I didn't know why, but I had to touch it. As my fingers brushed the stain, a voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But no one answered, only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath now, thick and misty in the air. Then the lights flickered violently before plunging the room into total darkness. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the top of the stairs. I wasn't alone anymore. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the cabin's broken windows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze burning through the darkness, drilling into my soul. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, its footfall echoing in the small basement. And then, with a voice that sounded like the cracking of dry wood, it whispered again, "Leave, before it's too late." But it was already too late. I didn't leave. Instead, I turned and ran up the stairs, through the cabin and out into the forest. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. But when I looked back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cabin was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? But every time I return to Bellingham, I feel that same pull, that same whisper, calling me back to the dark woods. and every time I ignore it, until the next time. Somehow, I know the dark pines are waiting. They're always waiting. Eighth story, The Whispering Pines. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of city life. My friends, Sarah, Jake, and Ben, had rented a cabin deep in the woods of Washington State. The kind of place that promises peace and solitude, miles away from the nearest town. Ben found it online. It looked perfect, secluded, away from prying eyes, a place where we could forget the world for a while. The drive there was long, but the scenery was beautiful. Rolling hills, dense forests, and the occasional glimpse of a distant mountain peak. The kind of view that made you feel small but at peace with it. We arrived just before dusk, and as we got out of the car, the smell of pine trees filled the air. The cabin was exactly what we were looking for. Rustic, charming, and tucked into the edge of a dark forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The first night was calm, too calm almost. We had dinner, laughed, and joked around. But as the evening wore on, something felt off. It wasn't a feeling you could put your finger on exactly, but it was there, hanging in the air like the stillness before a storm. Sarah was the first to mention it. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. We all paused, listening. At first, I thought she was joking. There was only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional crack of twigs underfoot, but then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from somewhere outside. "Probably just the wind," Ben said with a nervous laugh, though his face was pale. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "No, it's like someone's talking out there." We spent the next few hours debating it, but no one dared to venture outside to check. The whispers persisted, growing louder as the night deepened. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them. Faint, like someone was right outside the cabin, just beyond the window. And then, right before I drifted off, I heard my name. Soft, hushed. "Mark." I shot up, my heart pounding. I looked around the dark room. My friends were still asleep, their breathing slow and steady. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake it off. It had to have been a dream. A weird, vivid dream. But as the night wore on, the whispers continued, and they weren't just outside anymore. They were inside the house, moving from one room to another. I got up and checked the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything seemed secure. I wanted to wake Sarah, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was terrified, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Morning came, and with it the silence was gone. The whispers were just a memory, a lingering feeling of dread in my chest. We all woke up groggily, Sarah looking more disheveled than usual, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "You guys hear that too, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't laughing now. None of us were. That day, we decided to go for a hike to shake off the eerie feeling. The forest was thick and wild, the trees towering above us like giants. As we walked, Ben pointed out some old markings on the trees, strange symbols carved into the bark. "What do you think those mean?" he asked. I shrugged, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Probably just some kids messing around. But the further we went, the more I started to feel like we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, something, or someone, darting behind the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, the whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent. They weren't just outside anymore. They were in the cabin, coming from the walls themselves. The house groaned under the weight of whatever was moving inside it, and we could hear things scratching at the doors as if trying to get in. Sarah was the first to break. "We need to leave. Now," she said, voice shaking. Jake and Ben agreed, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was terrified, but part of me needed to know what was happening. Why was this happening? What was in the woods? I had to understand. That's when I saw it, just outside the window. A figure standing motionless in the dark. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for us. I ran to the door, but before I could reach the handle, I heard it again. "Mark." The voice came from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing. A woman stood in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt, her hair wild and tangled. She was dressed in an old, torn dress, as if she had been out there for years. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to stare right through me. "You should have left," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I tried to speak, to scream, but nothing came out. The air grew thick, suffocating, and then it all went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The cabin was gone, the forest was gone, and I was lying in the middle of a desolate, empty field. The sun was rising, but everything was silent, too silent. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no sign of Sarah, Jake, or Ben. They were just gone. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was the woods playing tricks on us, or maybe something darker was at work. But I'll never forget that face. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her whispering my name. "Mark?" But when I turn to look, there's no one there. Dear viewers, before we start the next horror story, I want to say, if you wish, you can support this YouTube channel financially through the details on the screen or in the description below the video. Thank you for your attention. Ninth story, The Whispering Trees of Washington. I still can't get rid of the feeling of being watched. It was the first time I heard the whispers. I thought I was imagining it, but then they started to follow me, and that's when everything changed. My name is Jake, and I grew up in a small town just outside of Washington. It's called Lakewood. Quiet, peaceful, not much happens there. But on one fateful evening in October, something happened that I can never forget. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Lakewood. I'd been out all day, hiking along the edges of the forest near the old bridge. It wasn't unusual for me to go for a walk there. I had been doing it for years. But this time, something felt off. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. The wind carried something with it, something that felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just the cold or maybe the rustling of the leaves, but then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it at first, like a voice just out of reach. I stopped, my heart pounding, straining to catch what it was saying. "Jake?" I spun around, but no one was there. The forest was silent again, except for the wind. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I started walking again, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They came from the trees, from the shadows. "Jake, help us!" I froze. The voice was closer now, almost as if it was standing right behind me. I turned around slowly, scanning the darkened forest, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their gnarled limbs swaying in the breeze. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. Then the whisper came again, and this time it was unmistakable. "Jake, come closer." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command, and for some reason I obeyed. I took a step forward, then another, until I was deep in the forest. The trees loomed over me, their dark trunks twisted and gnarled like something out of a nightmare. The whispers were now a constant hum, surrounding me from all sides. "Come, closer," to the old tree. I knew which tree they were talking about. There was an ancient oak in the heart of the forest, a tree that locals often spoke about in hushed tones. They said it was cursed, that it was home to something that should never be disturbed. But that didn't stop me. I was already too far in, and the whispers were pulling me like a magnet. When I reached the tree, I saw something that froze me in place. The bark was cracked, and something was carved into it. Deep, jagged lines that formed strange symbols. I didn't know what they meant, but they felt wrong, as if they were alive. I reached out to touch the tree, and that's when everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying on the cold forest floor, my head pounding. The whispers were gone, but something else was there. Something heavier. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't move. That's when I saw them. The figures in the shadows, emerging from the trees. They were like people, but not. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. One of them stepped forward, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. I could feel its presence, like it was inside my head, gnawing at my thoughts. I struggled, trying to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the air around me had thickened, pressing against my throat. My vision blurred, and the last thing I remember is the feeling of the ground beneath me, the shadows closing in, and the whispers returning. I woke up back in my bed in Lakewood, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was it a dream? Or had it been something worse? The whispers didn't stop. They followed me home. And now, every time I close my eyes, I hear them. Jake, we're waiting. I never told anyone what happened that night, not even my best friend Chris, who tried to drag me out of the forest when I didn't come back. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand. And now I can't escape. Because the trees are calling me back. The whispers are calling me. I know they're waiting, and I know I can't resist them forever. 10th story. The Hollow Night in Washington. I never believed in ghosts or curses. I always chalked up strange events to coincidence, or maybe just my overactive imagination. That was until I ended up in Washington, a city that had always been a bit too quiet for my liking. This wasn't the bustling city center filled with tourists or business people, but the outskirts, the old neighborhoods that barely saw sunlight anymore. It was here that I found myself, visiting my brother Nate, who had recently moved into a house on the edge of town. The house had been cheap. Too cheap, Nate joked. There was something odd about the place, an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake off. I'd driven up from Seattle to stay with him for the weekend, but I wasn't prepared for what I was about to experience. The first night I arrived, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. It was one of those rare, warm evenings, but the house felt cold, almost as if it was holding its breath. Nate was already acting strangely, avoiding eye contact and speaking in short sentences. He seemed different, like he had something he was hiding from me. I didn't want to push him, so I kept my questions to myself, thinking maybe it was just stress from the move. But then, things began to happen. Small things at first, shadows that flickered when I was sure no one else was around, a creak of floorboards in the middle of the night when no one had walked by. I thought I was imagining it. That is, until the first scream. It was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. A loud, horrific scream coming from somewhere deep in the house. I bolted upright, heart racing. It wasn't Nate. No, this was something else, something worse. I rushed out of my room and found Nate standing at the top of the stairs, pale as a ghost. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, his eyes wide, his body frozen in place. The air around us grew thick and heavy. I could feel the weight of something watching us from the shadows. I took a step forward, only to hear the whisper of a voice, low and barely audible, but unmistakably clear. "Leave, or it will take you too." I turned to Nate. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but he just shook his head, his face drained of color. "It's not real. It's not real." He repeated over and over, almost as if he were trying to convince himself more than me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying in that house another minute. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but the signal cut out. That's when I realized something was wrong with the whole town. No matter where I went, no one seemed to be around. I tried walking to the nearest gas station, but it was locked up tight, the windows dark. The entire place felt deserted. That's when I saw it, out of the corner of my eye in the reflection of a storefront window. A figure. Tall, thin, dressed in ragged clothes that seemed to blend into the night. Its eyes were hollow, pitch black, like two voids in the shape of human eyes. I spun around, but it was gone. Nate was still upstairs, his voice distant and strained. "You don't understand," he said when I went to find him. "It's here. It's been here for years." He led me down to the basement. The air grew colder as we descended, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. In the farthest corner of the basement, hidden behind boxes, was a door. It was old, wooden, with strange symbols carved into the frame. Nate told me it was a family secret, that the house had once belonged to someone else, someone who had disappeared decades ago. I didn't care about the history. I just wanted to get out. But Nate seemed different now, like he was under some kind of spell. His eyes were glazed and his voice was lower, almost otherworldly. "It's too late," he murmured, and I could feel my chest tightening, as though the air itself was closing in around me. "It's already inside." I ran, up the stairs, through the hallway to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The door had locked itself. The handle stuck, as if mocking me. I could hear the low hum of something in the distance, the sound growing louder, closer. I turned, my eyes frantically searching for an escape, when I saw Nate standing by the staircase, his expression twisted in agony. His body was trembling, but he didn't move. He was staring straight at me, his mouth slightly ajar as if he were trying to say something. That's when I realized it wasn't Nate. Not anymore. The creature, whatever it was, had taken him. The last thing I heard before the darkness took over was the same whisper I had heard earlier. Now, it's your turn. I woke up later, my head pounding. I was lying in a field, the house nowhere to be seen. I don't remember how I got there, but I know one thing. Whatever was in that house, it's still out there. And it's looking for me.